On nights when the wind howled like a starving animal outside the wooden shutters and the moon shone cold as hammered silver over the thatched roofs, medieval mothers learned secrets that kept their children alive when winter tried relentlessly to claim them. Secrets whispered from grandmother to daughter in drafty cottages where every degree of warmth meant survival. Secrets built not out of comfort, out of desperation, instinct and ancient knowledge of how to fight the cold with almost nothing. In those narrow one-room homes where the walls were made of stone that never truly warmed, and the floor was so icy that bare feet would go numb within seconds, a mother's entire world reduced itself each winter night to one small task: keeping her child breathing steadily beside her until dawn, a task that demanded quiet vigilance, careful planning, and a kind of tenderness shaped by hardship rather than luxury, a tenderness that was all warmth, no softness. Most evenings began the same way, long before the sun slipped behind the fields, because medieval women knew that nightfall did not simply mean darkness, but the slow creeping descent of cold that hardened the air and made even the simplest movement release a breath of fog. She would gather every scrap of warmth the household owned, from woolen wraps passed down for 3 generations to coarse linen sheets that had been patched so many times they no longer held their original weave, and she arranged them in layers, understanding instinctively that layering trapped air better than any single thick blanket could. Then, with the practiced hands of someone who had done this ritual every winter since her own childhood, she banked the fire, tucking ash around the last glowing embers so the heat would last through the long hours, and from that dim orange light she gauged whether the smoke curled smoothly upward or threatened to choke the room, because a warm child was no good if the warmth came with suffocating fumes, a balance every mother learned to read with a precision that felt almost magical. Beside the hearth, she placed a small bundle of dry straw covered with cloth, not to sleep on, but to warm the blankets before the children climbed in, knowing that cold bedding steals heat far faster than freezing air. And while she worked, she listened to the quiet breathing of her children, already drowsy, already curled together like small animals seeking the comfort of the pack. When it was finally time to sleep, she pulled them close against her body, because no medieval technique mattered more than shared warmth. The ancient truth that skin against skin keeps life in fragile bodies when the night turns hostile, and she wrapped her arms around them not just as a mother, but as a human shield against the cold, her own warmth given freely, so theirs would not fade. Sometimes, when the frost thickened so heavily on the inside of the windows that it looked like white lace pressed against the glass, a medieval mother would rise quietly in the middle of the night, moving with the slow care of someone who knows the floorboards will creak if she forgets where to place her weight, and she would check her children's faces with the back of her hand, feeling for the coldness that signaled danger long before the child could wake and complain, because winter rarely announced its threats loudly. It crept into breathing, into fingertips, into the trembling edges of a blanket. If the little ones' noses felt too chilled or their breaths came out in sharp, quick bursts, she would shift the bedding again, adjusting the layers like a strategist defending a fortress, tucking cloth under their sides, making a barrier against drafts that leaked through every crack of the cottage, drafts that travelled along the floor like invisible rivers of ice. And when even that wasn't enough, when the night sank into one of those deadly cold spells everyone in the village remembered for years afterward, she would press heated stones wrapped in wool near their feet, stones she had left by the hearth earlier, knowing they could not stay too hot or too cold, knowing they had to be wrapped just right so they warmed without burning, because precision was its own form of love in a home without luxuries. Other nights, she would bring the family's animals inside, a thin goat, a pair of chickens, sometimes the dog if it wasn't needed for guarding, not out of whim, but because body heat meant survival, and the presence of warm creatures in a small enclosed space could raise the temperature enough to keep her children safe, turning the single room into a quiet, living ecosystem of shared heat, breath, and patience. She also trusted in simple, ancient remedies, rubbing their hands and feet with animal fat to trap warmth, wrapping their heads with wool so precious it was mended every season, and making them breathe in the warm air rising from a small clay cup filled with hot water, a trick learned from her own mother and her mother before that, a reminder that knowledge, not comfort, was the true inheritance of the poor. And through it all, through the shifting blankets, the glowing embers, the bodies huddled together under a low timber roof, she would tell soft stories in a low whisper, stories meant not just to soothe frightened children but to distract them from the cold, stories about saints and forests and winter spirits, stories that curled through the darkness like threads of warmth themselves, binding the family into something that felt stronger than the winter raging outside. As the night deepened and the cold pressed harder against the cottage walls, a medieval mother understood that warmth was never just a matter of fire and blankets, but of watchfulness, because winter could steal heat even from the smallest oversight. And so she listened constantly to the rhythm of her children's sleep, the faint sighs, the shifting of tiny bodies seeking comfort, each sound telling her something about their struggle against the cold. She kept the children close to the warmest spot in the house, which was almost never right beside the fire, that was too risky, too smoky, too uncertain, but rather at a careful distance where the heat reached them without danger, a place chosen as deliberately as one might choose the safest road through a dangerous forest. And she arranged their sleeping positions so that the older siblings formed a protective outer ring while the smallest were tucked securely at the center, shielded from both drafts and the open air. Above them, herbs hung from the rafters, their dried leaves brushing faintly against the smoky ceiling beams whenever a gust of wind struck the house. And although those herbs did little to warm the room, their presence offered a small sense of ritual and continuity, a reminder that winter came every year, and every year families survived it by remembering old wisdom, how to keep a home dry, how to close gaps in the wood with wool scraps, how to store embers safely through the dark hours so the morning fire could be kindled in seconds rather than minutes. At times she would rise to stir those embers gently, not to blaze the fire back to life, but to encourage just enough glow to prevent the hearth from dying entirely, because relighting a fire from nothing in the freezing dawn could mean numb fingers, wasted time, and a dangerously long wait before the room warmed again. And she knew that a mother who let the fire die risked more than discomfort. She risked her children's lives. Every decision she made in those hours came from instinct honed by hardship, which cloth to place closest to their skin, so it wouldn't scratch, when to let them sleep uninterrupted, and when to wake them slightly, so they would shift and generate a bit more warmth, how to drape the heavy woolen cloak across them without letting its damp edges touch their faces, and even how to position her own body so that she acted as a living barrier against the cold air seeping through the stones. And while the room remained dim, lit only by the faint pulse of orange coals and the silvery beam of moonlight that sometimes slipped through the shutters, she would sit awake for a while, wrapped in her own thin layer of cloth, watching her children breathe softly in the half-dark, feeling the slow swell of relief that for another hour at least they were warm enough, asleep enough, safe enough to make it toward dawn, a dawn she knew would feel like a small victory, earned not by comfort but by quiet, unwavering endurance. As the cold hours moved toward the deepest point of the night, when even the animals inside the cottage fell silent and the world outside seemed frozen in a breathless pause, a medieval mother understood that the greatest danger came not from sudden storms, but from the slow and relentless drop of temperature that tightened around the house like an invisible fist. And so she shifted again, pulling the blankets higher, tucking stray corners, and making sure no little hand or foot had escaped into the open air, where numbness could settle without warning. She checked the small clay pot she had placed near the embers earlier, the one filled with water that she hoped would stay just warm enough to release a whisper of moisture into the dry winter air, because she knew that cold, brittle air could sting a child's throat and make breathing shallow, and though she had almost nothing to fight it with, she relied on tiny details, a cup of warmth, a cloth dampened slightly, a soft hum to keep their fragile lungs from tightening. Sometimes she would place her palm gently against their chests, feeling the rise and fall beneath layers of wool and linen, letting her own warmth flow through the contact, reassured by the steady rhythm that told her they were still deep in sleep, and safe from the dangerous trembling that came with cold creeping too close. And in that quiet moment she felt a fierce, silent gratitude that her vigilance held steady when the night was at its darkest. Outside, the wind scraped against the wooden walls with a sound like distant voices, and she knew the snowdrifts were piling once again along the side of the house, sealing them in like a cave, which was both a blessing and a danger. A blessing because the snow insulated the walls, trapping warmth inside. A danger because too much weight could strain the old beams, and every winter came with stories of roofs that collapsed under the silent load of heavy storms. Yet, even with that knowledge resting in the back of her mind, she focused on the small, immediate world around her, the faint glow of the hearth breathing its last pulses of light, the soft warmth of the children pressed close together, the gentle rustle of blankets shifting as their bodies settled deeper into sleep, the quiet feeling that for now she had done everything she could, everything she had learned over years of surviving winters that tested patience, courage, and the limits of endurance. And as she finally lay back down, curling her body in a protective half-circle around the little ones, she listened to the wind, the slow heartbeat of the night, and the soft breaths of her children blending into a single, fragile symphony of life that had managed once more to keep the darkness at bay. Toward the first pale hint of dawn, when the sky outside the shuttered window shifted from pitch black to a faint, cold blue that carried no warmth at all, the medieval mother stirred again, not because she had slept deeply. Winter rarely allowed that luxury, but because centuries of survival had taught women like her to wake instinctively at the moment when night loosened its grip, that fragile hour when the temperature often dropped even lower before the sun finally rose and pushed the darkness back. She moved slowly, cautious not to disturb the children who had finally fallen into the heaviest, most peaceful sleep, and yet she knew she had only a small window before the cold began creeping under the blankets again, and so she slipped carefully from beneath the shared coverings, feeling the immediate sting of icy air on her skin, a reminder of just how thin the margin of safety was in these winters where comfort was never guaranteed. Her first task always was the fire, and she knelt beside the hearth with practiced focus, brushing aside the layer of ash to uncover whatever embers remained, glowing faintly like tired eyes, and for a moment she held her breath, hoping she had banked them well enough during the night, knowing that if the coals had died entirely, she would face the difficult, numbing work of kindling a new flame from scratch in the morning freeze. If even a single ember still survived, a tiny stubborn spark tucked beneath the ash, she coaxed it back to life with the patience of someone who had done this countless times, adding dry twigs, blowing gently, shielding the small flame with her hands until it caught and grew, because warmth in a medieval home always began from almost nothing, and that small flickering light was the first sign that her family would make it another day. As the fire grew stronger, she added thin branches followed by thicker logs, stepping back only when the hearth began to glow with a comforting orange that slowly pushed back the shadows, and she stood for a moment in the gentle radiance, letting her cold, stiffened fingers absorb the heat, knowing she needed to warm herself before she could lift the children from their bed of layered cloth. Only then did she return to them, brushing hair from their foreheads, touching their cheeks with her fingertips, and feeling the relief that they were still warm, still safely nestled against each other, still breathing steadily in the softened light creeping through the window, which meant her long night had been successful. She had guided them through the cold's quiet siege with nothing but instinct, vigilance, and the fierce determination that motherhood demanded in a world where winter took without hesitation. She lifted the blankets just enough to let in the rising warmth from the hearth, careful not to startle them awake, wanting their transition from the chilled night to the new day to be gentle rather than abrupt, because she understood the importance of preserving even the smallest comfort in a life where comfort was rare and precious. And as their faces relaxed in the growing heat, she allowed herself to exhale fully for the first time since dusk. As the fire strengthened and its warmth drifted gradually across the small cottage, the medieval mother began the quiet morning rituals that helped her children adjust from the brittle cold of the night to the slow, cautious warmth of dawn, moving with a softness born from years of practice, knowing that abrupt changes, in temperature, in light, in rhythm, could unsettle little bodies already exhausted from enduring the winter darkness. She retrieved the wooden ladle left near the hearth and dipped it into the clay pot where she had kept a small supply of water, now barely above freezing, and she placed it beside the fire so it could warm gradually, not because the children would drink it immediately, but because warm water had a way of soothing the throat after a night of breathing cold, dry air, and she believed with absolute certainty, formed from experience rather than knowledge, that such small comforts protected them in ways she could not fully explain. While the water warmed, she checked their clothing: woolen tunics, linen shirts, patched wraps, items worn so many times they had softened at the edges, fabric tired but still dependable, and she held each piece near the fire just long enough to take off the chill without scorching it, because starting the day with warm clothing was a tiny luxury. She tried to give them whenever the weather allowed, a luxury that might make the difference between comfort and shivering through an already difficult morning. Then, as the children began to stir beneath the blankets, their eyelids fluttering in the dim orange glow, she leaned close and whispered their names softly, waking them with the gentleness of someone who remembered all too well what it felt like to be jolted from sleep into freezing air, and she watched as their faces shifted from confusion to the fragile calm of dawning awareness, their breath forming faint steam in the cold pockets of the room untouched by the hearth. She helped them sit up slowly, pulling the warmest layers around their shoulders, guiding their small hands toward the fire without letting them touch too close, and she smiled quietly when she saw their bodies relax, their shivers fading as the heat reached them, and in that moment she felt again the deep, humble satisfaction of having carried them safely through another night that could have turned dangerous so easily, had she been less attentive, less experienced, or simply unlucky. Outside, the world remained harsh and white, the ground hard as iron, the trees coated in frost, and the breath of distant animals rising like pale smoke in the morning air. But inside that modest cottage, the struggle had paused, replaced for a little while by the warm, slow rhythm of morning, by the crackling of wood, by the comfort of shared presence, and by a mother's quiet triumph over a night that had once again tested the limits of everything she could give. And as she watched the children stretch their limbs beneath the blankets, blinking sleepily in the soft glow of the firelight, she felt the kind of deep gratitude that didn't need words. Gratitude for warmth, for survival, for another dawn earned the hard way, and she knew that tonight, and every night that followed, she would repeat the ritual, not because she wished for hardship, but because she had the strength to endure it, and through that strength her children would live. As morning finally settled into the cottage, and the fire cast longer, steadier shadows across the stone floor, the medieval mother began preparing for the day ahead, aware that the warmth she had fought so carefully to preserve during the night would fade again with evening, and that the cycle of protection would start anew long before the sun completed its slow path across the winter sky. She guided the children closer to the hearth, wrapping their layers snugly around them as they blinked the last traces of sleep from their eyes. And while they huddled near the fire, their small hands extended toward the rising heat, she stepped outside for a brief moment, the cold hitting her like a hard wall, sharp and punishing, reminding her that warmth was never something she could take for granted, not even for a heartbeat. She checked the snow piled against the house, brushing away the sections that threatened to block the door or collapse softly into the walkway, and she scanned the horizon for signs of more storms, the sky shifting slowly in pale colors that offered no guarantees, because winter weather was unpredictable and merciless, and mothers like her had learnt to read the clouds the way others might read a prayer book. When she stepped back inside, the children were waiting, their cheeks flushed with the gentle heat, their bodies no longer stiff with cold, and she moved efficiently through the room, tightening the shutters, adjusting the hanging cloth meant to block the worst drafts, and adding another small log to the fire so it would burn long enough to warm the air before she began the rest of the day's work. Even in these small actions, moving blankets from one side of the room to another, checking the seams of the walls for icy leaks, smoothing the straw beneath their bedding, there was a rhythm shaped by countless winters, a rhythm that balanced caution with endurance, ensuring the children would not lose the warmth their bodies had finally gained after a long and difficult night. Only when she was satisfied that the room held a stable, gentle warmth did she settle beside them, offering warm water in wooden cups and soft bread that had been kept wrapped in cloth near the hearth for this very purpose. And as they ate slowly, still drowsy, she studied their faces with the kind of attentive love that grew sharper in winter, watching for signs of fatigue or chill, ready to act again if the cold showed any sign of returning too quickly. And in those quiet moments, as the crackling fire filled the silence and the morning light crept softly through the shutter slats, she allowed herself a breath of calm, not triumph, because winter allowed no boasting, but a brief, steady calm, knowing that she had guided her children through another night that could have easily overcome them, and that through her vigilance, knowledge, and quiet strength, the fragile warmth of their small home had endured. As the morning stretched further into daylight, the medieval mother began tending to the quiet but essential tasks that would determine how well they could face the next freezing night, because winter survival was never about a single moment of effort, but about a constant, steady preparation that threaded itself through every hour of the day, shaping her movements with purpose, even when the children simply saw them as routine. She shook out the blankets one by one, lifting them toward the faint sunlight so the fibers could breathe, knowing that trapped moisture, even the smallest amount of it, could turn a warm blanket dangerously cold once night returned, and though her hands trembled slightly from the lingering chill, she worked with patience, smoothing each layer before draping it carefully across the wooden frame near the fire, allowing the heat to dry what the night had dampened. She then spread fresh straw beneath the bedding, its rustling sound filling the quiet room as she arranged it evenly, because she knew the straw not only added softness, but acted as insulation, trapping pockets of warm air between its stalks, and she learned long ago that a well-layered bed could be the difference between waking in comfort or waking trembling in the darkness. Her next task was to check the few possessions they had for signs of winter's damage: the water bucket for cracks caused by freezing, the clay pot for chips along the rim, the linen shirts for worn seams that needed mending. And she did this not out of habit but out of necessity, because losing even one small item during the harshest months could be catastrophic when replacements were impossible to obtain. Meanwhile, the children, now fully awake and warmed by the fire, played softly in the corner, their laughter quiet but real, a delicate sound that seemed to lighten the cold air inside the cottage, and the mother watched them from the corner of her eye, letting herself enjoy the brief moment of peace, while also staying alert, knowing that illness or exhaustion could hide behind even the most innocent smile during winter. Once the chores were done, she prepared a simple meal, a thin broth reheated from the night before, thickened slightly with whatever grains they had left, and served it to the children while the fire crackled steadily behind them. And though the food was plain and sparse, the warmth of it filled their small bodies, spreading slowly from their stomachs outward, reinforcing the strength they would need when the sun dipped once again, and the cold reclaimed the land. And as they ate together, she felt again that quiet but unshakable resolve, a resolve shaped by countless winters, and strengthened by the understanding that warmth was not merely a physical state, but an act of care, vigilance, and love, carried out endlessly, night after night, with no expectation of praise, only the deep, steadfast hope that her children would survive the season's unforgiving chill. As the day unfolded slowly in the pale winter light, the medieval mother understood that every hour offered a fragile window in which she could gather strength, prepare the home, and rebuild the warmth her children would desperately need when night returned with its familiar, merciless hunger. And so she moved through the cottage with the quiet determination of someone who knew that survival depended not on dramatic gestures, but on the steady rhythm of small intentional acts repeated faithfully through the coldest months. She checked the remaining firewood stacked beside the door, lifting each log in her hands and feeling its weight, testing its dryness by the sound it made when she tapped it lightly against another piece, because wet wood would smoke without heating the cottage, filling the air with a thick, choking haze that forced her to choose between warmth and breath, a choice she refused to face if she could prevent it through careful planning earlier in the day. Outside, where the world waited under a blanket of snow so thick it seemed to mute every sound, she ventured out once more, her boots sinking into the frozen crust that cracked beneath her steps, and she inspected the wooden shingles of the roof, looking for the telltale sag of snow gathering too heavily in one spot, because she had heard stories whispered by neighbors, repeated by elders, of roofs collapsing in the middle of the night when snow became too heavy, trapping families beneath the shattered beams and icy weight, and she would not allow such danger to creep silently into her home. Returning inside, she carried with her a bundle of thin branches gathered from near the edge of the forest, branches crisp with frost but still dry inside, perfect for kindling the evening fire, and she placed them neatly beside the hearth with the same instinctive order her mother had taught her years ago, an arrangement that allowed her to build a flame quickly and quietly when the cold began to tighten around the cottage after sunset. She then turned her attention to the children, who played quietly with a handful of carved wooden toys, their cheeks warm from the fire, their laughter soft and fleeting, drifting like small sparks through the heavy winter air, and though she smiled at the sight of them, she also watched with careful eyes, noting which one tired too quickly, which one rubbed their hands together too often, which one's breath formed a thicker plume of steam, tiny clues that told her how well their bodies were coping with the lingering cold. To keep them warm through the day, she layered their clothing once more, adding woolen wraps over linen shirts, binding the layers gently around their small frames, ensuring that no skin was exposed to drafts that wandered through the house like pale ghosts, and she reminded them in a soft voice to stay near the hearth, to keep their feet wrapped, to drink warm water, and to rest when they felt tired, because winter demanded obedience even from the young. At midday, as the faint sunlight filtered weakly through the shutter slats, she prepared another simple meal, a stew thinned with water to stretch its contents, but warmed long enough that steam rose from the bowl and filled the air with a comforting aroma of herbs and root vegetables, and she served it to the children carefully, letting them hold the bowls in their hands so the heat seeped into their fingers before traveling deeper into their bones. When the meal was finished and the bowls washed and placed upside down to dry near the hearth, she began the slow process of reheating stones near the fire, warm, smooth stones she would later wrap in cloth and tuck at the foot of their bedding, knowing that even small pockets of warmth could make the difference between a peaceful night's sleep and the frightening shivers that sometimes preceded illness. And as she worked, she hummed a soft melody, the kind of song that mothers handed down through generations, not a lullaby, but a working song, steady and low, a rhythm to quiet the anxieties winter brought. Throughout the afternoon, she mended their clothing by the window, pushing tiny needles through thick fabric with fingers made stiff from cold, patching worn elbows, reinforcing seams, tightening hems that had loosened from constant use, and she did all this while keeping one ear attuned to the crackling fire, listening for shifts in its tone. The fire spoke, in its own language, telling her when it needed more fuel, when it faltered, when it burned too quickly, and she understood it the way others understood speech. As the light dimmed, she gathered the blankets once more, pressing them near the fire to warm them before nightfall, rubbing her palms across the wool to soften the fibers, and she felt the familiar mixture of weariness and determination settle into her bones, because she knew that soon she would face another long night of watchful rest, another slow battle against the cold, and yet she embraced the work without complaint, driven by the deep, unspoken truth that every act of warmth she created was not just survival, it was love in its purest, quietest form. By the time the sky darkened fully, and the shadows lengthened across the floor, she had rebuilt the home into a place fit to withstand the darkness once more, and as the children nestled close to the fire, she prepared herself for the night ahead, knowing that the cold would come again, patient and persistent, but she would be ready, just as she had been every night before, a guardian of warmth standing watch over the most fragile lives in the heart of winter. As twilight settled over the village, and turned the sky into a muted canvas of deep blue and fading gold, the medieval mother felt the familiar shift in the air, that subtle tightening of the cold as it reclaimed the land, once the sun slipped behind the distant tree line, a cold so sharp and intrusive, it seemed to seep into the very stones of the cottage, preparing to test once again the fragile warmth she had built throughout the day. She closed the shutters firmly, pressing her weight against the wood to ensure they sealed as tightly as possible, knowing that even the smallest crack could become a pathway for icy draughts that would wander silently into the room during the night, curling around the children's feet, creeping into their blankets, and stealing warmth with a quiet persistence that was far more dangerous than any storm beating violently against the roof. Then she moved through the cottage in a slow, methodical pattern, checking each cloth drape hung along the walls to block drafts, smoothing the edges of the straw bed where the children would sleep, and tightening the knots of wool strips tied around gaps in the doorframe, each action performed with the blended skill of experience and instinct, as though she were preparing a small fortress to withstand the siege of winter darkness. The fire crackled obediently as she added 2 more logs, chosen carefully for their density and dryness, so they would burn for hours without roaring too loudly, because a sudden burst of heat could fade just as quickly, while a steady, ember-filled glow offered the gentle, consistent warmth that allowed her children to sleep through the worst of the cold without waking shivering or frightened. She warmed the blankets by the hearth, lifting them and shaking them gently so the fibers loosened, then folding them over her arm to carry their warmth back to the bedding, and she worked silently, her movements slow and deliberate, the kind of ritual that did not need words to hold meaning, because this was the language of survival, quiet, meticulous, unending. By the time the children settled into their place on the layered straw and cloth, she had already placed the warmed stones at the foot of the bedding, wrapped carefully in wool to prevent burns but still radiating enough heat to protect their feet and legs from going numb as the night deepened. The children curled instinctively around each other, their breath soft and rhythmic, their small bodies forming a cluster of shared warmth that their mother adjusted with practiced hands, tucking their hair behind their ears, smoothing creases in the blankets, and ensuring no patch of skin remained exposed to the cold air that lingered restlessly in the corners of the cottage. Only once they were secure did she settle beside them, drawing her own thin woolen cloak around her shoulders, and positioning her body just close enough to offer warmth, but not enough to restrict her movements, because she knew she would rise several times throughout the night to tend the fire, check the stones, and make sure no gust of wind had found its way inside. Outside, the wind began to rise slowly, moaning against the side of the cottage, like some ancient creature wandering the dark fields in search of weakness, and the sound mixed with the soft rustling of tree branches rubbing together under layers of frost, forming a low, haunting symphony that would have frightened the children if they were awake, but in sleep it became only a distant murmur, muffled by the protective cocoon their mother had created around them. She sat awake for a long while, watching the firelight flicker across the walls, its glow revealing every rough texture of the stone, every hanging herb, every shadow that stretched and contracted with the shifting flames, and she listened carefully, not for threats, but for signs, the subtle change in the fire's crackle, the shift in the children's breathing, the soft creak of the wooden beams responding to the growing cold outside. Her thoughts wandered to memories of winters past, nights when storms had trapped them indoors for days, when illnesses spread quickly through the village, when the cold had humbled even the strongest households, and those memories made her grip the blanket edge with renewed resolve, because she understood better than anyone how precarious their survival always was, how thin the line between warmth and tragedy could be, in a world where even the well-prepared could fall victim to the whims of winter. Yet she remained steady, her heartbeat calm, her breath slow and controlled, because she knew that fear had no place here. There was only vigilance, patience, and the quiet strength she carried within her, a strength passed down through generations of women who had endured the same winters, fought the same cold, and whispered the same stories into the darkness to keep their children from waking in fright. Hours passed like this, slow, heavy, marked only by the shifting glow of the hearth, and when she finally lay down beside her children, she did so not in exhaustion, but in readiness, knowing that the moment a blanket slipped, or the fire dimmed too quickly, she would feel it, rise, and tend to it with the same unwavering determination that had carried them through the long winters of their ancestors. And as the firelight softened, and the wind continued its lonely song outside, she rested with the quiet assurance that she had done everything she could to protect her children from the night's cold embrace, her presence forming the final shield between them and the forces beyond the fragile walls of their home. As the night progressed into its coldest, most unforgiving hours, the medieval mother felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle deeper into her bones, a weight she did not resist but rather embraced, understanding that these lonely stretches of darkness were the true battlegrounds on which her children's safety depended. Because winter did not attack with sudden fury but with slow, creeping tendrils of cold that sought out any weakness in the home, any lapse in attention, any moment when the fire burned too low, or the blanket slipped too far from a small shoulder. She rose quietly, not wanting to disturb the soft symphony of breathing around her, and she stepped toward the hearth with bare feet that recoiled at the icy touch of the floor, her movements careful and deliberate, guided by the dim glow of embers that pulsed faintly beneath a thin layer of ash, and she knelt beside them with the patient focus of someone whose life depended on the outcome of a single fragile task. With practiced fingers she brushed away the ash, revealing a cluster of red-orange cores that looked weak but still alive, and she placed thin twigs around them, layering them in a small, intentional pattern that allowed air to pass through, and then she leaned close, shielding the tiny structure with her hands, glowing gently until a flicker of flame formed, a small trembling light that grew slowly, catching the twigs, climbing, strengthening, until the hearth glowed once more with the steady, dependable warmth she needed to carry her family through the rest of the night. When the fire was stable again, she sat back on her heels, stretching her stiff fingers toward the heat, feeling the warmth seep gradually into her skin, filling the spaces between her knuckles, loosening the ache that cold had tightened there. And for a brief moment she allowed herself a quiet exhale, not of relief but of readiness, because she knew the night was far from over, and winter would not relent, simply because she had managed to revive the fire. She moved next to check the warm stones she had wrapped earlier in thick cloth, touching them lightly with the back of her hand, evaluating their temperature as though she could see the heat simply by feeling its presence, and when she judged that they had cooled too much, she replaced them with freshly heated ones from the hearth, slipping them gently beneath the blankets where her children slept, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of their body heat. The children stirred slightly at the change in warmth, their small bodies adjusting instinctively, curling deeper into one another like fox kits in a burrow, and the mother paused to study their faces, illuminated softly by the glow of the fire, round cheeks flushed from sleep, hair in soft disarray, lips slightly parted in the slow, even breathing that told her their bodies were resting deeply, recovering from the cold that every winter night forced them to endure. She brushed a stray curl from her youngest child's forehead, her touch feather-light, the movement almost instinctive, and she felt a tiny swell of gratitude at the warmth of their skin, knowing that if their cheeks were cold or their hands stiff, It would mean the cold had slipped past her defenses, something she had vowed would never happen under her watch. The cottage around them creaked softly, the wooden beams expanding and contracting in the cold, and the sound blended with the distant cries of animals outside. A lonely owl, the faint howl of a wolf far beyond the fields, the whisper of snow shifting on the roof, all familiar winter noises that filled the silence without threatening it. And the mother listened with the stillness of someone who had learned over many years to distinguish harmless sounds from ones that signaled danger. She sat for a while near the children, her back resting against the edge of the straw bed, allowing the rhythmic rise and fall of their breaths to lull her into a light, watchful half-sleep, that fragile state in which her mind never fully drifted, but remained attuned to every shift in the room, every flicker from the fire, every change in the air that might signal dropping temperature or a draft that needed to be blocked. Outside, snow continued to fall in slow, muffled sheets, blanketing the village in a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the world whole, and the mother, hearing it settle against the shutters, felt both comfort and unease. Comfort because the snow insulated the house like a natural barrier, trapping heat inside. Unease because too much accumulation could strain the structure and bring weight that the old beams might not withstand. But she trusted her instincts, trusted her preparations, trusted the processes she repeated night after night, winter after winter, and she wrapped the blankets around herself as she lay down beside the children again, positioning her body so she formed a protective crescent, one arm draped lightly over them, her hand touching the edge of the blanket, where she could feel even the smallest shift and correct it before the cold found its way underneath. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly, letting the warmth of the fire and the soft sound of her children's breathing anchor her in the moment. And though exhaustion tugged gently at her, she welcomed it in the same way one welcomes a heavy blanket, not as a weakness but as a familiar companion, trusting her body's instinct to wake the moment anything changed, the moment the fire dimmed, the moment a child stirred in discomfort, the moment the cold dared to push closer. And as the hours continued their slow march toward dawn, she remained there, half awake, half dreaming, wholly protective, a guardian of warmth in a world of unforgiving winter, her presence the final barrier between her children and the cold vastness of the night. As the darkest stretch of night finally began to soften, not with light, because the sun was still far from rising, but with a faint loosening of the cold that wrapped itself around the cottage, like an iron grip, the medieval mother stirred again, not because she wished to wake, but because a shift in the air, subtle and nearly imperceptible, told her that something in the room required her attention, and her body responded before her thoughts fully formed, rising, with a slow, instinctive determination that had kept her family alive through countless winters. She moved through the dimness with the silent grace of someone who knew every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the fire, every shifting draught that slipped beneath the door, and though the children remained asleep in their small, warm cluster, she knew the night was not yet finished with them, that the cold would make one final attempt to reclaim the warmth she had built, as it always did before dawn. The fire's glow had faded to a deep, pulsing red, the logs reduced to a bed of glowing embers that still radiated heat, but no longer cast light strong enough to reach the far corners of the room, and she knelt beside the hearth, brushing her fingers gently across the surface of the ash to gauge the temperature, feeling the small changes in warmth that guided her next actions with the precision of an experienced sentinel. She added thin kindling first, laying the pieces carefully in a pattern that allowed air to flow between them, because she knew that winter fires needed to be coaxed awake, not startled, and then she placed two smaller logs at an angle, creating a small pocket where a flame could catch, grow, and spread slowly across the wood, filling the room once more with steady heat. When she leaned forward and blew softly across the embers, the glow brightened, expanding like a creature roused from sleep, and within moments the thin kindling sparked to life, its crackling sound rising through the darkness like a quiet sigh of relief. And she sat back on her heels, watching the flames strengthen with a kind of reverence, because fire in winter was not simply a tool, it was a living companion, a fragile ally that required constant care, devotion, and understanding. Once the fire regained its steady rhythm, she checked the stones at the foot of the bedding, lifting them slightly to judge their warmth, and when she felt they had cooled too much, she replaced them with freshly heated ones, wrapping each stone in layers of cloth before sliding them carefully back into place, ensuring the children slept without interruption, their feet protected from the creeping chill that often invaded through the floorboards during these final hours of night. She touched each child lightly, a hand to a forehead, a palm to a shoulder, a gentle brush across a cheek, reading their body temperature with the intuitive accuracy only a mother could possess. And she allowed herself a quiet exhale when she found them still warm, still safe, still cocooned in the layers she had so carefully arranged. Then, for a moment, she sat in silence, her back resting against the wooden support beam near the hearth, letting her gaze soften as she watched the fire grow with renewed energy, its golden light spreading across the stone floor, catching the edges of the rough walls, illuminating the hanging herbs with a soft flicker, and revealing the simple beauty of the home she fought so hard to maintain. Her thoughts drifted to the other mothers in the village, women she knew by name, women who also sat awake in the dark, tending fires, checking blankets, soothing restless children, and she felt a quiet connection to them, a sense of shared endurance that stretched beyond the boundaries of individual households, binding them all through the unspoken truth that motherhood in winter was a collective struggle, a quiet, relentless battle fought in every cottage, in every village, across every generation. She imagined how each of them, scattered across the snowy valley, were performing the same rituals at this very moment, adding kindling to dying fires, replacing cold stones with warm ones, whispering soft reassurances into the darkness, and she felt a swell of calm pride at being part of this ancient chain of guardians who kept life moving forward through seasons that might otherwise have halted it entirely. The wind outside had settled into a low, steady hum, no longer howling but murmuring along the edges of the cottage, as though resigned to wait for the next opportunity to invade, and she listened to the soft sounds that filled the small room, the crackle of the fire, the even breathing of her children, the faint rustle of wool as they shifted gently in their sleep, a trio of sounds that wove together into a fragile harmony of warmth and safety. She remained awake for a while longer, allowing the fire to strengthen fully before closing her eyes again, her body curling protectively beside her children, one arm draped lightly over them, her breath slow and steady, her mind half alert even in rest, because mothers of her world did not sleep as others did. They drifted in and out of consciousness, always listening, always ready to rise before the cold could reclaim what she had fought so tirelessly to preserve. And as the faintest hint of dawn began to stir far beyond the shuttered window, a whisper of light still hours away from breaking into the sky, she rested, knowing that, for another stretch of the night, she had held the darkness at bay, guarded the fragile warmth of her home, and carried her children one step closer to the morning that promised another day of endurance, another day of preparation, and another night she would face with the same unwavering resolve. As the final stretch of night settled into that strange, suspended stillness that exists just before dawn, a stillness that felt neither fully asleep nor fully awake, as if the entire world held its breath in quiet anticipation, the medieval mother found herself drifting once more into the delicate rhythm of half-sleep, that fragile state in which her mind floated gently between awareness and rest, listening instinctively to every small sound in the cottage, ready to rise the moment something shifted out of place. The fire now burned with a steady pulse, its golden glow pooling across the floor, and warming the air in slow, expanding waves that softened the sharp edges of the winter cold, though she knew that beyond the thin walls the darkness still clung fiercely to the frozen world outside, filling the fields and forests with an icy silence, so heavy it seemed almost physical. But inside her modest home, the The center of that vast, freezing world felt surprisingly tender, a small island of warmth built through patience and vigilance, through rituals repeated every night, through a mother's quiet devotion. And as she lay curled around her children, she could feel the heat radiating softly from their bodies, blending with her own, forming a shared warmth that protected them more effectively than any blanket or burning log. It was in this peaceful cocoon that her thoughts drifted, not in sharp images or clear memories, but in soft impressions, the way thoughts form when a person is almost dreaming. Memories of winters when she herself was a child, wrapped tightly in her mother's arms in a cottage, much like this one, listening to the distant howling of wolves and the crackle of the hearth while feeling the same mixture of safety and vulnerability that her children felt now. She remembered how her mother's hands had smelled faintly of wool and smoke, how her rough, warm fingers had brushed frost from her hair after she returned from playing outside, how her mother's voice, low and calm, had filled the darkness with stories of spirits who guarded children during winter nights. Not frightening spirits, but gentle ones, protectors who moved silently through the cold, unseen but ever present. Now, lying here decades later, she felt the weight of that inheritance. A chain of mothers stretching backward farther than memory could reach, each passing down knowledge not through books or lessons, but through gestures, habits, instincts learned in long winters where survival depended on such wisdom. And she wondered, not with worry but with a serene acceptance, how her own children would carry this knowledge forward, how they might one day tend fires of their own, and wrap their children in blankets warmed by the hearth, repeating these same movements without ever questioning where they came from. Outside, the wind changed direction, shifting from a high whisper to a deeper, slower murmur, brushing snow against the side of the cottage with a soft, rhythmic sound like distant waves breaking on a shore. And she listened carefully, her senses attuned to the nuances of winter weather. She could tell from the tone that no storm approached. This was the calm lull that often came before the sky began to lighten, a sign that dawn, however faint, was approaching. With slow, quiet movements she rose from the bedding, her knees stiff from hours spent curled tightly on the straw, and she walked toward the door, her body moving softly through the warm air as though she were drifting through a dream, rather than crossing the small space between the hearth and the entrance. She placed her hand gently on the wooden door plank, and felt the cold radiating through it, sharper and more concentrated here than anywhere else in the room. And she knew instinctively that beyond this barrier lay a world untouched by warmth, a world still locked in night. She leaned her ear toward it, listening for the subtle cues that told her about the state of the village, the creak of distant trees shifting under frost, the faint groan of snow settling on rooftops, the total absence of human movement. Satisfied that the outside world posed no immediate threat, no wolves too close, no signs of storm, no cracking weight of fresh snow on the roof, she returned to the hearth, adding one more small log to the fire, not because it was necessary now, but because she wished the flames to be strong when the children woke, allowing them to meet the new day not with shivers but with a soft, welcoming warmth. She sat again next to them, pulling her cloak loosely around her shoulders, and brushed her hand gently along the edge of the blankets, watching them rise and fall with the slow, peaceful rhythm of deep sleep. And she felt a profound sense of calm settle over her, the kind of calm that came only at the end of a long night of vigilance, when every small danger had been kept at bay through quiet work and unwavering care. Her breathing slowed, her pulse softened, and as she lay back down, the firelight danced gently across the ceiling beams, creating a warm, flickering mosaic above her, and she closed her eyes with the peaceful certainty that dawn would come soon, carrying with it the promise of another day, a day of work and preparation, yes, but also a day of life, warmth and endurance, earned through the quiet, unspoken strength that mothers like her carried through every winter night. As the first pale suggestion of dawn finally began to gather behind the distant horizon, not yet visible, not yet strong enough to cast light across the frozen world, but present in the air like a slow, deep breath taken by the sky. The medieval mother felt the gradual shift inside the cottage, a shift not in temperature but in atmosphere, as though the darkness itself had softened slightly, loosening its grip on the land after its long, relentless hold throughout the night. She remained lying beside her children for a moment longer, listening to the combined music of the crackling fire and their steady breathing, feeling the fragile warmth radiating from their small bodies, warmth that had been preserved through vigilance rather than chance, and she allowed herself a rare luxury, a single moment of stillness in which she did not think about the firewood, or the blankets, or the cold waiting to reclaim the world the moment the flames weakened, a moment in which she simply breathed, matching her rhythm with the faint pulse of life inside the cottage. But stillness for her was never more than a brief pause. Winter did not permit long rests, and so she rose slowly, her body shifting carefully so as not to disturb the children, and she stood in the gentle glow of the fire, stretching her stiff limbs as she adjusted the heavy wool cloak around her shoulders. The cold air bit at her ankles as her feet touched the floor, a sharp reminder that even with a strong fire, warmth in a medieval home was always partial, inconsistent, fragile. She crossed the room with soft steps and opened the wooden shutter just a fraction, enough to allow a thin line of dawn-grey light to spill into the cottage. What she saw outside was the familiar sight of deep winter, a world transformed into hard shapes and muted colours, the ground hidden beneath a thick sheet of snow, the trees standing bare and skeletal against the dim sky, smoke rising sluggishly from a few chimneys in the village, each one a sign that other mothers, other families, had also survived the night. But the cold that seeped through the narrow crack in the shutter made her close it quickly, sealing the warmth inside the cottage once more. She knew that the sun would offer little comfort in these months. Its light might brighten the sky, but the icy air would remain as fierce as ever. Winter light was a strange thing, beautiful but powerless, a gentle glow that illuminated without warming. Returning to the hearth, she knelt beside it again, stirring the embers with a long iron rod, pleased to find them healthy and bright beneath the layer of ash. She added a few more pieces of wood, arranging them with a practiced touch so the flames would climb steadily, not in a sudden burst that wasted precious heat, but in a controlled rise that would warm the room evenly as the morning unfolded. The fire responded obediently, stretching upward in graceful ribbons of gold and orange, casting moving shadows across the walls, and with that light the cottage seemed to breathe again, shedding the last remnants of night. She lifted the clay pot of water from its place by the hearth, feeling the warmth radiating through the surface, and she poured a small portion into a wooden cup, letting it steam gently in the cold air before setting it aside, a small offering of comfort she would give the children as soon as they woke. Warm water soothed the throat, calmed the stomach, and eased the tightness left by breathing cold air through the long hours of winter darkness. Then she began preparing their simple morning meal, using ingredients she had rationed carefully, a handful of grains, a small piece of dried root vegetable, and the leftover broth from the night before. She combined them in a clay bowl and set it near the fire to warm slowly, stirring it occasionally, watching as steam rose in delicate curls that drifted through the air like small ghosts illuminated by the firelight. As she worked, she cast quiet glances toward the children, their faces peaceful, their limbs tucked under the blankets, their breath steady and soft, and she felt the same deep, grounding gratitude that had accompanied her through every winter morning. Gratitude that they had made it through the night, that the cold had not taken hold, that the warmth she had fought for had endured. Her gaze lingered on each of them, and she remembered how fragile they had seemed when they were newborns, how tiny their fingers had looked curled around her thumb, how fiercely she had promised, silently, instinctively, that she would protect them from everything she could, even from the things no one could truly control, like the bitter winters that shaped their lives. She reached for their clothing next, lifting each garment with careful hands, checking for dampness, smoothing the fibers, warming the fabric over the fire, so that when the children finally woke and slipped into their tunics, the cloth would feel welcoming rather than harsh and cold. She knew from experience how small comforts could shape the rhythm of a day, how a warm shirt could make a child more willing to work, to play, to endure the long hours before dusk returned. By the time the sky outside had brightened into a faint silvery morning light, the room had filled once more with warmth, and with the quiet strength of her presence, a strength that needed no words, no explanations, no acknowledgement, because it existed as naturally as the rising sun, woven into everything she did, into every act of care, every breath, every step. And as she returned to the children's side, brushing a loose strand of hair from her eldest's forehead, she felt again that deep certainty, not pride, not relief, but a quiet, enduring truth, that no matter how harsh the winter was, no matter how long the nights stretched, she would face it all with the same unwavering resolve, because warmth in a home like hers was not just fire and blankets, but love made visible through action, through sacrifice, through every small gesture performed in the dim, flickering glow of a winter hearth. As the dim morning light finally began to gather behind the heavy winter clouds, spreading a soft, muted glow across the snow-covered landscape, the medieval mother sensed that the long night had fully broken, even though the air remained sharp and icy, and she felt the subtle shift inside the cottage, a shift not of temperature but of spirit, as if the world were slowly waking after holding itself motionless for hours. The children still slept, their small bodies curled tightly beneath the warm layers, and she took a moment to study them, memorizing the quiet peace on their faces, because in winter such peace was a fragile treasure, something fought for and earned through hours of vigilance, and she knew that each night of rest, each morning of safety, was a small victory in the endless struggle against the season's unforgiving harshness. She wrapped her cloak more snugly around her shoulders as she crossed the room, her feet padding softly across the straw-strewn floor, and she approached the window once more, opening the wooden latch just enough to peer outside without letting too much cold slip into the room. The air beyond was still brutal, a biting, crystalline chill that hung over the village like a veil, but she read it carefully, noticing how the tree branches no longer swayed violently, how the snowflakes drifted slowly rather than being swept by fierce winds. This was a calm morning, she decided. Not warm, certainly, but calm enough to step outside for a short while to gather more wood, to clear the path, to inspect the roof's edges for dangerous piles of snow. Yet she resisted the urge to rush. Winter taught her patience more than anything else, and the morning would unfold at a pace dictated by the cold, by the fire, by the children's waking, not by any hurried impulse. Returning to the hearth, she stirred the simmering broth gently, releasing a warm aroma into the air, a scent of nourishment and simple comfort that filled the small space and seemed to push the cold even farther back into the corners of the cottage. She lifted a spoon to her lips, testing its warmth, ensuring it was neither too hot nor too thin, and she felt satisfaction settle in her chest at the thought that her children would wake to something warm that could ease their transition from the cocoon of blankets to the reality of another winter day. She arranged the children's clothing near the fire, allowing the heat to soften the linens and warm the wool, smoothing each garment with her hands. The fabric was worn in places, mended carefully with threads that did not always match, but each piece held the work of many nights, countless hours of stitching done by firelight and tired eyes, work she had performed, not because it was expected, but because she understood the profound difference between a child stepping into cold clothes and a child wrapped in warmth prepared with intention. As she worked, she hummed a low melody, one she remembered hearing from her mother during her own childhood winters, a song with no clear beginning or end, just a soothing rhythm that filled the quiet space between breaths. The notes blended seamlessly with the crackle of the fire, the faint rustle of the straw, and the distant stillness outside, becoming part of the cottage's slow morning heartbeat. Then she stepped outside, bracing herself as the cold wrapped instantly around her, tightening her breath for a moment before she adjusted to it. The snow crunched beneath her boots, each step sinking into the soft, powdery layer left by the night's quiet snowfall. The village around her was silent, the rooftops blanketed in white, smoke rising lazily from a handful of chimneys, signs that other mothers had also begun their morning rituals, each house holding its own battle against the cold, each woman guided by the same instinctive desire to keep her children alive and warm through the season's relentless trials. She checked the stack of firewood outside the door, brushing snow from the top pieces and selecting a few logs that were dry enough to burn well. She carried them inside, the weight solid and familiar in her arms, and placed them carefully beside the hearth, arranging them in an orderly pile that would last through the morning hours. Then she went to the edge of the roof, lifting her gaze to inspect the overhanging snow. The gentle sloping of the cottage's structure allowed much of it to fall naturally, but in some places it clung stubbornly, forming heavy drifts that could become dangerous as the day warmed slightly. With the wooden pole she kept for this purpose, she nudged at the edge of one such drift, watching as a curtain of snow slid down in a soft rush, scattering into glittering powder when it hit the ground. Satisfied with her work, she stepped back inside, grateful for the wave of warm air that greeted her when the door closed behind her. She shook the snow from her cloak and boots, then returned to the hearth, where the fire had grown steady and strong, its dance of flame painting the room in shades of amber and gold. The children stirred at last, their small bodies stretching beneath the blankets, eyelids fluttering in the soft light, and she knelt beside them with a smile that rose naturally, a quiet expression of love and relief. They blinked up at her, still half dreaming, their cheeks rosy from sleep, and she offered each of them a warm wooden cup, guiding their tiny hands around the smooth surface, as steam curled gently into the air. The first sip always brought the same reaction, a soft sigh, a deep breath, a moment of comfort that washed away the last traces of night's cold. She tucked their clothing around them, lifting their arms gently to slip sleeves in place, fastening belts and ties with practiced hands, and she marveled, as she often did, at how quickly children adjusted to the world, how their cold-numbed fingers regained warmth within minutes, how their eyes brightened at the sight of a morning meal, how they greeted the day not with dread but with curiosity. Only when they were dressed, fed, and warm did she allow herself to sit on the floor beside them, leaning back against the wooden beam with a slow, tired exhale, her eyes softening as she watched them play quietly near the fire, stacking small wooden figurines, tracing shapes in the straw, whispering stories to one another the way siblings do when the world outside feels too vast and cold to face alone. And in that moment, that brief, peaceful slice of morning, when the cold was held back, when her children were safe, when the house glowed with the warmth she had built, she felt a deep stillness settle inside her, a stillness made of gratitude and endurance and the quiet, unbreakable truth that love, in a winter like this, was not spoken in words but woven into every act of care she performed from dusk until dawn. As the children settled into their gentle morning play, their fingers tracing patterns in the straw, and their voices reduced to soft, wandering murmurs, the medieval mother allowed herself a rare moment of quiet observation, watching the way the firelight reflected in their eyes, the way their cheeks glowed faintly from the warmth of the hearth, the way their small bodies seemed almost weightless now that the heavy burden of the night had lifted. She saw in them not just her children, but the fragile continuation of life that winter tried so often to halt, a continuation she guarded with a devotion so instinctive it did not require thought, only motion, only presence. She reached for her spindle, the familiar wooden tool worn smooth from years of use, and began to twist wool into yarn with slow, steady movements, the kind that required little focus but kept her hands warm and her mind anchored in the present moment. The soft whir of the spindle blended with the crackle of the fire, creating a gentle soundtrack to the morning, while the children's ongoing murmurs filled in the spaces between sounds, weaving the room into a tapestry of quiet domestic harmony that belonged only to winter mornings like this. As she spun the wool, She let her gaze drift occasionally toward the window, where the world outside remained still and white. The heavy snow muted under the pale light of a sun hidden behind thick clouds. She could see the faint outline of smoke rising from neighboring cottages, spiraling upward into the cold air, and she imagined the other mothers moving through their homes just as she was now, weaving, cleaning, preparing what little food they had, tending to their own fires, their own children, their own hopes for the day. The thought filled her with a sense of belonging, a reminder that even in the isolation winter brought, she was part of a larger rhythm, a network of women bound not by proximity but by experience, each one performing the same quiet acts of care, the same patient rituals of survival. It was a community of effort that did not need gathering places or spoken words to exist. It lived in the shared will to endure the season, to protect what mattered most. When the yarn grew long enough, she wound it carefully around a small wooden peg and set it aside, reaching for another tuft of wool. Her movements remained rhythmic and smooth, but her thoughts wandered ahead, planning the tasks she needed to complete before dusk returned. Winter days were short, unforgivingly short, and she knew that what she did in the hours of light determined how well her children endured the hours of darkness. She would need to go to the well before midday, a task that required careful timing because the water froze quickly when drawn out too early and turned too cold to handle if drawn too late. She would have to check the roof again before more snow accumulated, and she would need to mend the children's heavier cloaks, the ones they wore for brief ventures outside when the cold was particularly merciless. She also had to warm the stones again before nightfall, gather fresh kindling, and prepare the bedding so it would not trap moisture from the day's warmth. But she did not rush these thoughts. She held them loosely, knowing winter forced a slower pace, one in which tasks could not be hurried but had to be approached with patience, measured steps, and respect for the cold's unpredictable temperament. For now, all that mattered was the gentle rhythm of her spindle, the murmur of her children, and the steady breath of the fire that kept the icy air at bay. The youngest child soon wandered toward her, rubbing sleep from his eyes even though he had been awake for some time, and she lifted him effortlessly into her lap, wrapping her cloak around him so the warmth of her body enveloped him. He nestled against her chest with a soft sigh, curling his small fingers into the folds of her clothing, and she rested her chin lightly on his head, inhaling the faint scent of smoke and wool that clung to his hair. This closeness, this quiet, unspoken bond, was what winter could never take from her. Even when the nights grew impossibly cold and the days were burdened with endless work, these moments of gentle connection fortified her spirit, reminding her why she endured so much with such steady resolve. She rocked him lightly, letting the motion soothe them both, and felt the warmth of his small body seep into her own, a comfort as precious as any fire. Her older children paused their play to glance at her and their brother, exchanging smiles that held both affection and a maturity beyond their years, a maturity shaped by living through harsh winters that taught them empathy and responsibility early in life. They moved closer to the hearth, arranging their wooden figures with more care, as though mimicking the quiet attentiveness of their mother. After some time, when the little one slid from her lap to rejoin his siblings, the mother rose once more to stir the pot of broth, her movements smooth and purposeful. The aroma had deepened, filling the cottage with a warmth that felt almost like a second fire, and she ladled the thickened liquid into small wooden bowls, placing them carefully on the floor near the children so they could eat together in the glow of the hearth. They gathered around her with eager but calm anticipation, each child cupping the bowl in both hands, letting the warmth seep into their palms before lifting it to their lips. Their breaths puffed gently into the air as steam rose from the broth, creating a soft mist that caught the firelight and made the moment feel almost sacred. A simple meal transformed into a quiet celebration of survival. The mother watched them eat, her gaze full of both tenderness and sober awareness, because she knew that everything she did, every stitch sewn, every ember tended, every blanket warmed, existed for these moments. these small but powerful reassurances that life continued despite the winter's attempts to halt it. And when the bowls were empty and the children wiped their mouths with the backs of their hands, offering small, contented smiles, she felt once again that deep, anchoring sense of purpose settle into her chest, strong and steady as the fire that burned behind her. In that warm, glowing corner of the cottage, surrounded by her children and the fruits of her morning's work, she knew that no matter how cold the nights became, no matter how relentless the winter tried to be, she would face it again and again with the same unwavering, instinctive strength, the strength of a mother protecting her world, one breath at a time. As the morning meal settled warmly in the children's bellies and the fire cast a steady glow across the small cottage, the medieval mother began preparing for the next essential task of the day, a task both ordinary and deeply tied to survival, the gathering of fresh water from the village. Well, a journey short in distance but heavy in effort during the unforgiving months of winter. She moved toward the corner where the family's wooden bucket sat, running her hand along its rim to check for cracks caused by the freezing temperatures, feeling relief wash through her when she found none, because a broken bucket in winter meant far more than inconvenience. It meant the possibility of going without water until a repair could be fashioned, and repairs took time, skill, and materials that were often scarce when everything around them lay buried under snow. She wrapped a thick woolen scarf around her neck and pulled her heaviest cloak from the peg near the door, shaking off the faint dusting of frost that had settled on its edges during the night. The cloak was heavy, weighing on her shoulders like an added burden, but it trapped warmth better than anything else she owned, and she tied it firmly beneath her chin, before lifting the wooden bucket and holding it against her hip, with a practiced ease that came from years of performing this same routine in countless winters. Before stepping outside, she turned once more toward the children, who now sat near the hearth building small shapes from bits of straw, their bodies relaxed and warm in the fire's embrace. She reminded them gently to stay close to the flames, to keep the blankets around their shoulders, to avoid touching the cold stones or wandering too near the draught by the door, and they nodded in that quiet, obedient way children did when they understood the rules, not as restrictions but as simple truths shaped by the cold. Then she opened the wooden door and stepped into the bitter morning air, feeling the cold strike her face like a sharp wave of icy needles, forcing her to inhale quickly as her breath crystallized instantly in the air. The world outside was bright in a muted way, the sun hidden behind a thick shield of winter clouds, but still illuminating the landscape enough to make the snow shimmer like crushed glass spread across the earth. The village lay still, wrapped in a blanket of silence that made every crunch of snow under her boots sound amplified, echoing faintly between the houses. She moved steadily along the narrow path that wound between cottages, her feet sinking into the soft powder with each step, the cold pushing at her legs through the thick wool of her skirts, as though testing the limits of her clothing. She passed other homes along the way, smoke curling gently from chimneys, and she imagined the families inside performing their own morning rituals, stirring fires, warming water, pulling blankets tighter around sleepy children, each household engaged in the same quiet battle against the cold, bound together by the shared rhythm of winter life. When she reached the well at the center of the village, she paused to catch her breath, placing the bucket down at her feet while she brushed loose strands of hair from her forehead, her fingers stiffening slightly from the cold. The well stood silent, its stones rimmed with frost, the rope stiff and coarse from the freezing air, but she knew that beneath the surface the water remained clear and life-giving, protected from the cold by the depth of the earth. She gripped the rope, feeling the rough fibers against her palms, and began lowering the bucket slowly into the dark opening, listening for the faint splash that signaled the water had been reached. The rope uncoiled with steady friction, the sound soft and rhythmic, and when the splash finally echoed up from below, it felt like a small victory, a quiet confirmation that the well had not frozen solid overnight. Drawing the bucket back up was harder, far harder than lowering it, the rope stiffening in her hands, the weight of the water pulling heavily at her shoulders, but she worked steadily, muscles straining beneath her cloak, breath steady, despite the cold that nipped at her nose and reddened her cheeks. When the bucket finally emerged, water sloshing just below the brim, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment, the simple satisfaction of having secured yet another necessity in a season that offered very few. She carried the bucket back toward the cottage carefully, mindful of the way the water shifted with each step, threatening to spill if she moved too quickly. Her arms ached slightly, but she welcomed the sensation, a reminder that her body was strong, her determination unwavering, her purpose clear. When she reached the door, the warmth that escaped from the crack between the wood and the frame felt like a soft exhale against her cold, chapped skin, and she stepped inside, closing the door quickly behind her to keep the precious heat from fleeing into the winter air. The children looked up when she entered, their faces lighting with small smiles, as though her return restored something essential to the rhythm of their morning. She set the bucket near the hearth, letting the heat warm the surface of the water, so it would not sting their hands or throats, and peeled off her cloak, hanging it near the fire to dry any frost that had settled on it during her journey. For a moment she simply stood there, feeling the fire's warmth seep back into her bones, her breath steadying, her shoulders loosening, and she watched her children resume their play, their laughter a soft, comforting sound that filled the room like sunlight might in a warmer season. She realized then, as she often did in these quiet moments, that survival in winter was not built on the grand struggles that outsiders imagined, but on these countless small victories: a bucket of water, a burning fire, warm blankets, a bowl of broth, the gentle rise and fall of a child's breathing, in the early hours of dawn. And as she knelt beside them, tucking a stray blanket around her youngest, she felt again that deep, unwavering truth that guided her through every cold day, that her strength was not loud or visible, but lived in every small act of care, every silent decision, every long night spent keeping watch. As the warmth of the freshly drawn water began to spread gently through the cottage, mingling with the rising heat of the fire and the soft, playful murmurs of the children, the medieval mother allowed herself a slow, grounding breath, the kind that reached deep into her chest and released the lingering tension built through the morning's cold tasks. She placed her hands briefly on the rough wooden surface of the table, feeling the faint warmth it had absorbed from the hearth, and let her gaze wander around the room, tracing the familiar shapes and shadows that defined their small world. The cottage, though modest and worn, held a quiet resilience within its walls, beams darkened by smoke from countless winters, a stone hearth polished smooth by years of tending fires, shelves lined with clay pots, wooden bowls and bundles of drying herbs that gave the air a faint, earthy scent even in the heart of winter. Everything inside bore the mark of use, of effort, of necessity, yet together these objects formed a kind of sanctuary, a place strengthened not by luxury but by the steady rhythm of survival. The children, now warmed and full, had settled into a calmer kind of play, arranging their small wooden figures into elaborate scenes that only they understood: tiny knights, carved animals, and roughly shaped people placed carefully in circles or rows as their imaginations filled the gaps with voices and stories. The mother watched them with a soft, lingering fondness, knowing that in winter children became masters of quiet invention, crafting entire worlds out of straw and wood, and imagination because the cold outside kept them indoors for so many hours of the day. Still, she knew that too much stillness could make their bodies stiff and their spirits restless, so after giving them a few moments to finish their game, she rose and moved across the room, lifting a woven basket from beneath a wooden bench. Inside it were small tasks suitable for young hands, tufts of wool, a few dull wooden needles, scraps of cloth meant for patching, and thin strips of leather that could be braided into simple ties. She carried the basket toward the children, kneeling beside them as she set it down, and their faces brightened with interest, each reaching instinctively for a familiar task. These were not chores in the unpleasant sense of the word. They were part of a winter ritual, small duties that helped the household function, while also giving the children a sense of purpose, teaching them slowly, quietly, gently, that survival was a shared effort, not a burden carried solely by their mother. The eldest child picked up a length of wool and began twisting it into loose yarn with clumsy but enthusiastic hands, mimicking the movements he had watched his mother perform countless times. His younger sister sorted through the cloth scraps, matching colors and sizes with a seriousness far beyond her years, while the smallest child simply held a tuft of wool, squeezing it thoughtfully as though deciding whether it was soft enough to keep as a toy. The mother smiled as she watched them, her heart warming with a tenderness that softened even the harshest edges of winter. She knew that these moments, quiet, shared, purposeful, were as important to their survival as firewood and food, because they fostered resilience, cooperation, and a sense of belonging that strengthened them against the cold's emotional weight, just as blankets protected them physically. She returned to her spinning, her spindle whirling steadily as the wool twisted between her fingers, forming a smooth and continuous thread that she wound onto a wooden distaff with slow, practiced movements. The rhythm calmed her, grounding her thoughts in the present moment even as her mind wandered gently ahead, planning the tasks that awaited her throughout the day. She would need to mend her eldest's cloak before nightfall, she reminded herself. The seam near the shoulder had grown weak, and cold air would seep through it mercilessly if left unattended. She also had to check the food stores, ensuring the root vegetables had not begun to freeze in the colder corner of the cottage, and she needed to prepare another pot of broth for the evening, slicing what little they had into thin pieces, so the meal would stretch just enough to warm the children without exhausting their supplies too quickly. But she also allowed herself to acknowledge something softer, that the daylight hours, though short and often filled with labor, were still gentler than the long, relentless nights. The day brought small comforts the night could not: the faint glow of light through the shutters, the softer air around the hearth, the steady rhythm of shared tasks, and the sense that time flowed differently, less sharply, less urgently, than it did in the coldest hours before dawn. From outside came the distant sound of footsteps crunching through snow, slow and deliberate, followed by the muffled voices of neighbors exchanging morning greetings as they passed one another along the narrow paths. The mother listened quietly, recognizing the cadence of familiar voices, even when the words were indistinct, and she felt that faint but comforting sense of community once more, the knowledge that she was not alone in this season, that other families rose to the same cold mornings, tended the same kinds of fires, faced the same relentless demands of winter. At that moment, a small knock sounded at the door, a gentle, cautious tapping that carried easily through the quiet room, and the children looked up with wide eyes, curiosity sparking in their expressions. The mother stood slowly, smoothing her skirt with one hand as she approached the door, and she opened it just enough to see who stood on the other side. Outside was a neighbor, a woman close to her own age, wrapped tightly in a heavy cloak, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and her breath rising in faint clouds as she greeted the mother with a polite, weary smile. She held a small bundle wrapped in cloth, offering it forward with both hands, a gesture of kindness, of shared survival, of simple generosity. Inside the bundle was a small loaf of coarse bread, still slightly warm from the morning's baking, and a few dried herbs meant for steeping in water to soothe sore throats. The mother accepted the gift with humble gratitude, exchanging quiet words of thanks, and she offered in return a small pouch of finely spun wool, not much, but enough to acknowledge the kindness and maintain the unseen balance of neighborly generosity that sustained the village through harsh seasons. These exchanges were not obligations but lifelines, threads of humanity woven through the cold, forming a fabric of support that even winter could not tear apart. When she closed the door again, the warmth enveloped her instantly, and she held the bundle for a moment, savoring the faint heat radiating from the bread before placing it carefully on the table. The children watched with anticipation, their eyes following her every movement, sensing instinctively that something special had entered their home. She cut the bread into thin slices, thin enough to stretch among them without indulgence, but thick enough to grant each child a moment of comfort, and the steam that rose from its interior filled the room with a scent so gentle and warm it seemed to soften the very air. She gave each child a piece, and their expressions brightened instantly, gratitude shining in their eyes as they savoured the simple gift. Moments like these, she knew, were what carried them through winter. Not just the fire and the blankets and the careful rationing of food, but the acts of kindness exchanged between neighbours, the small joys shared inside the home, the gentle rituals that reminded them all that life still held sweetness even in the harshest months. As she watched her children eat, the fire crackling softly behind them, the mother felt a deep, steady sense of peace fill her, a peace earned through effort, struggle, patience, and endless devotion. And in that warm, glowing room, held together by firelight, wool, bread, and love, she knew that the strength she gave her children each day would become the foundation of their memories, shaping the way they understood not just winter, but the world itself. As the children finished their small pieces of warm bread, crumbs clinging to their fingertips, and smiles softening the cold-chapped edges of their lips, the medieval mother felt a subtle lightness settle inside the cottage, a lightness born not from abundance but from the simple comfort of sharing something warm in the heart of winter. Such moments, fragile and fleeting as they were, had a way of easing the weight of the season, if only for a little while, and she let that feeling linger inside her chest like a slow ember before returning to her work. She gathered the wooden bowls and placed them carefully near the hearth, rinsing them with a small scoop of warmed water from the bucket, her movements deliberate and gentle, so as not to splash or waste a single drop. Water in winter was precious, drawn with effort, heated with care, preserved with intention, and she handled it the same way she handled fire, as a delicate ally that sustained her family when the world outside grew hostile. While she worked, the children shifted into another quiet game, this time shaping strands of straw into small wreaths and loops, intertwining them with the seriousness of artisans crafting something meaningful. Their little hands moved with surprising precision, revealing a dexterity developed through daily winter tasks that encouraged fine motor skills and creativity. The mother watched them from the corner of her eye, her heart swelling with a gentle pride at how well they adapted to the cold months, how they found joy in simplicity, how they created warmth from artful play even when warmth was scarce. Outside, the village sounds grew slightly louder, though still muted by the thick snow. She heard the soft thud of someone chopping wood in the distance, the rhythmic scraping of a broom clearing a doorstep, the faint bleating of a goat from a neighbouring pen. These familiar noises formed a kind of orchestra that signalled winter life continuing in its quiet determination, each household performing its own humble symphony of survival. The mother stepped toward the window once more, lifting the shutter just enough to peek outside. The sky had grown brighter, though still wrapped in a blanket of grey clouds, and the air held a shimmering crispness that hinted at another cold day ahead. Snowflakes lingered in the air, like tiny shards of glass suspended by an unseen hand, drifting lazily as though unsure whether to fall or remain afloat. She closed the shutter again, sealing the warmth back inside, and turned her attention to the hearth. The flames had settled into a stable dance, their glow deepening into gold as they consumed the logs she had added earlier. She reached for a wooden ladle and carefully stirred the pot of broth, watching it thicken slightly as the herbs inside released their flavour, their scent rising in soft curls of steam that filled the room with comfort. As she stirred, her thoughts drifted once more to the tasks ahead, each one necessary, each one a piece of the larger effort that ensured her children's survival through another winter's day. She would need to fetch more firewood before dusk when the cold sharpened again with renewed force. She would need to check the seams in the children's cloaks, reinforcing them with thick, careful stitches that kept the wind from slipping through. She would also need to examine the small cracks forming near the doorframe, stuffing them with wool or scraps of cloth to block the draughts that could steal warmth at night. These tasks filled her mind not with dread but with purpose, giving structure to her day, shaping the hours into a series of gentle rituals that connected her to generations of women before her. She knew their strength lived on in her hands, in the way she layered blankets, in the way she monitored the fire, in the way she listened to her children's breathing during the coldest moments of night. That lineage, unbroken and unspoken, guided her movements like a soft, invisible thread. When the broth was finally ready, she ladled small portions into the wooden cups, setting them near the hearth so they would remain warm until needed. The children looked up, noticing the preparation, but she gestured gently with her hand, signaling that this meal was for later, part of their midday sustenance, and they nodded, understanding that winter required patience even in eating. With a soft sigh, she moved to the corner where the bedding lay, gently lifting each blanket and shaking it near the fire to rid it of the night's moisture. The fibers released small clouds of steam as they warmed, and she held them close to the flames, feeling the heat seep through the fabric and into her hands. She inspected each layer carefully, the coarse outer wool, the softer inner cloth, the straw beneath, ensuring that everything was dry and warm before reassembling the bedding for the evening ahead. The youngest child toddled toward her and tugged lightly on the edge of her skirt, seeking her attention. She knelt beside him, smoothing his hair back with a warm hand, and he leaned into her touch with a sleepy, contented sigh. It was in these small gestures, the weight of a tiny hand on her clothing, the warmth of a child pressed lightly against her, that she found the deepest comfort, a reminder that her efforts carried meaning far beyond the tasks themselves. She lifted him into her lap and rocked him gently, her cloak wrapping around his tiny frame like a second blanket, and she hummed the low, steady melody of an old winter song, the same one her mother had sung to her, the same one she knew her children would someday hum to theirs. The rhythm soothed him, his eyelids fluttering as he surrendered to the warmth of her embrace, and she held him there, feeling his heart beat against her chest, feeling her own steady breath sink with his. After a while, he slipped down from her lap to join his siblings again, and she stood, stretching her back in a slow, deliberate motion, the kind of stretch that came from both fatigue and quiet satisfaction. The fire burned steadily. The broth simmered softly. The children were warm and fed and safe. For now, these things were enough. She walked to the door and opened it again, stepping outside with careful steps. The cold wrapped around her instantly, but she welcomed it this time, breathing it in with purpose, as she inspected the snowbank near the cottage's wall, checking that it had not risen too high. She brushed away small drifts that had accumulated near the threshold, clearing a path wide enough for her to move freely in and out, without letting the cold sweep in behind her. The sky had brightened further, though the sun remained hidden, and she watched as wisps of wind skimmed across the snow's surface, lifting tiny spirals of powder into the air. There was no storm coming. She sensed it the way her mother once had, only the deep, steady stillness of a winter day settling across the land like a hushed lullaby. She returned inside, closing the door with a soft thud, and for a moment she simply stood there, holding onto the wooden frame as she let the warmth embrace her again. The children looked up and smiled, their faces glowing in the firelight, and her heart tightened in her chest with a mixture of love and fierce protectiveness. She moved toward them, kneeling once more to gather them into her arms, feeling the soft weight of their bodies, the gentle press of their small hands against her clothing. She whispered something too soft for words to carry, a breath, a wish, a silent promise made only in the hearts of mothers, and held them close as the fire crackled behind her, shedding warmth into the room like a blessing. And in that moment, surrounded by her children, wrapped in the glow of the hearth, she understood again why she endured every harsh dawn and every merciless night. Because warmth in a winter like this was not simply heat, but the fragile magic of keeping her children safe, the power of transforming cold into comfort, the quiet triumph of another day won against a season that offered nothing freely. As the morning hours slipped quietly toward midday, and the fire maintained its steady glow, filling the cottage with a warmth that soothed the bones and softened the edges of the winter cold, The medieval mother felt the subtle shift in the rhythm of the day, the gentle turning point where the early urgency faded and the long, slow stretch of daytime living began, offering a brief but precious reprieve from the endless cycle of night watchfulness. She moved through the room with the calm confidence of someone intimately familiar with every creak of the floorboards, every draught that slipped beneath the door, every shadow cast by the uneven flame, her presence shaping the cottage the way wind shapes snowdrifts, quietly, constantly, without need for attention or praise. The firelight brushed across her face in waves of gold, warming the concentration in her eyes as she surveyed the space, checking instinctively for any small detail that required her attention. Her children, now fully awake and restored by their simple morning meal, had settled into a soft, comfortable rhythm of play. Their laughter reduced to gentle whispers as they rolled wooden figurines across the floor, rearranged piles of straw into miniature landscapes, and traced delicate shapes onto the frost-kissed window pane. Their cheeks glowed with the delicate flush of warmth, their breath soft and even, their movements unhurried, a sign that the cold no longer pressed urgently at them, at least not for the moment. The mother watched them, lingering for a moment in the quiet pride that rose naturally within her, pride not for grand achievements, but for the fragile, hard-won peace of this winter morning, a peace that felt almost like a luxury in a world where survival often left no room for stillness. She crossed the room toward the hearth, lifting one of the heavy logs she had set aside earlier, and angled it into the fire with careful precision, positioning it so the flames would catch without smothering the embers. The log crackled softly, its edges glowing orange as the fire welcomed it into its dance, and she felt a familiar warmth spread through her hands as she held them near the flames, absorbing their energy. Fire was not merely heat in these months. It was companionship, a silent ally, a symbol of endurance in the face of a cold that showed no mercy. She turned next to the wooden table, where she began to sort through the contents of a small woven pouch, dried berries carefully saved from the autumn harvest, a pinch of crushed herbs meant to strengthen the broth, and a few thin slices of dried root she had set aside for days when the cold seemed to seep more deeply into their bones. She handled each ingredient with reverence, aware of how precious they were, how each small piece carried the memory of warmer days and the promise of nourishment during the harshest season. As she prepared the midday pot, chopping, stirring, sprinkling the herbs with a slow, measured hand, the children gathered nearby, drawn by the scent and the warmth, their wide eyes following every motion as though they were watching a delicate ritual. And perhaps it was a ritual in its own way, one that linked food, warmth, survival, and love into a single act that filled the room like a soft incantation. Outside, the world remained a frozen expanse of white and grey, hushed beneath a thick blanket of snow. The distant figures of villagers moved slowly along the narrow paths that wound between the cottages, each wrapped tightly in heavy cloaks, their movements deliberate and cautious as they carried bundles of wood, checked on animals, or exchanged brief greetings before continuing on their way. The cold dictated the pace of life, and every person understood its authority. From within the cottage, the mother could hear occasional sounds drifting from the village, the muted clank of a blacksmith testing his tools, the low murmur of neighbors trading small comforts or necessary items, the faint cry of a child calling after a parent, and these sounds reminded her again of the quiet fabric of community that held them all up in winter, a fabric woven from countless small interactions, gestures and unspoken agreements that everyone shared the burden of the season. She stirred the pot again, her movements subtle and fluid, and then stood, rolling her shoulders to ease the tension built from hours spent hunched over tasks. She crossed the room to the children, smoothing a blanket around her youngest, who had curled himself into a soft bundle on the straw-strewn floor, his tiny fingers tracing invisible patterns through the air as he whispered to himself in the dreamy language of early childhood. She lifted him gently, placing him against her hip with an ease that came from years of constant motion, and he rested his head on her shoulder, his warm breath brushing lightly against her neck. She held him close, walking slowly across the room, swaying slightly to soothe him, and with each step she felt the soft, grounding weight of his trust, a trust that anchored her and strengthened her with a quiet, immense force. After settling him back down with his siblings, she opened the cottage door again to let a small gust of crisp air pass through, just enough to refresh the room without letting the cold take hold. The wind slipped inside in a delicate ribbon, swirling lightly around her before dissolving near the hearth, and she closed the door once more, sealing in the warmth with a gentle, careful push. She returned to her spindle again, the familiar whirring sound rising into the space like a soft lullaby, and began to spin new yarn from the wool she had washed and dried the previous day. The spindle turned smoothly between her fingers, the wool twisting into a fine, even thread that would later become part of a blanket, a cloak lining, a patch for worn clothing, small pieces of winter protection that she built bit by bit, hour by hour, thread by thread. The children's quiet play, the fire's steady hum, the faint scent of herbs rising from the pot, and the rhythmic turning of the spindle blended into a harmony so gentle and comforting that the entire cottage seemed to breathe with them, warm and alive despite the world outside lying frozen under winter's stern watch. And as she worked, the mother's thoughts drifted, not anxiously, not in worry, but with the peace that came from knowing she had faced the hardest part of the day already, that the morning's burdens had been met, that her children were warm, nourished, safe, and quietly content. In this fragile window of midday calm, she felt a rare sense of ease settle into her chest, like the soft glow of embers that continued to burn even after the flames lowered. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the hearth wash across her face, and in that stillness she felt something close to gratitude, not for abundance or luxury, which winter never offered, but for endurance, for the strength of her hands, for her children's resilience, for the small daily victories that stitched themselves together into the story of their survival. And as she opened her eyes again, gazing at her children bathed in the soft glow of firelight, she knew that every challenge winter brought was met with the same unwavering, quiet power, the power of a mother determined to keep her children warm in a world that gave them very little warmth of its own. As the slow, gentle hours of midday unfolded within the warm glow of the cottage, the medieval mother felt the rhythm of the day settle into its most peaceful state, that quiet, suspended plateau between morning urgency and evening preparation, when the fire burned steadily, the children were calm and content, and the cold outside seemed, for a brief time, less like a threat and more like a distant presence pressing softly against the walls. She paused her spinning for a moment, setting the spindle carefully on the low wooden bench beside her, and stood to stretch her arms toward the ceiling beams, feeling her muscles loosen with a soft sigh. The warmth of the hearth clung to her skin, soothing the faint ache that lingered in her shoulders from carrying water and tending the fire earlier in the morning. She let her hands rest for a moment on the rough-hewn wood of the beam overhead, drawing comfort from the sturdy structure that had sheltered her family through many winters. Her eyes drifted toward the door, where a faint line of cold light traced the threshold, reminding her that despite the peace inside, the world remained frozen and unforgiving beyond the wooden walls. But she no longer felt rushed to face it. She had already stepped into that cold once today, and the tasks that required braving the outside world could wait until later in the afternoon, when she felt replenished by the warmth and calm of the present moment. The children, sensing the shift in her posture, quieted their play even further, turning their soft murmurs into whispers as if in respect for the quiet unfolding in the room. The eldest rearranged his small collection of straw ornaments, giving them places near the hearth where they could dry and stiffen, while the middle child traced circles in the dusting of frost along the window's edge, creating tiny stories with her fingertips, stories of warmth, of sunlight, of distant seasons she remembered only faintly but longed for with a child's gentle simplicity. The youngest crawled toward her and tugged lightly at her skirt again, his sleepy eyes reflecting the firelight like tiny amber stones. and she scooped him up with a fluid motion, pressing him close to her chest as she walked back toward the fire. His small hands rested on her shoulders, warm and trusting, and she swayed gently from side to side, letting the familiar motion soothe him into a half-doze, while the flames painted soft patterns of gold across his cheeks. She sat down on the low stool by the hearth, holding him securely as she fed the fire with a thin piece of bark that caught quickly, sending sparks upward in a delicate shower before settling into a bright flame. The warmth curled around them like a living presence, and she felt the child's breath slow as he relaxed against her, his tiny fingers curling slightly into the fabric of her wool cloak. For a moment, a precious fleeting moment, she allowed herself to rest fully, her body leaning slightly into the warmth of the fire, her mind drifting softly toward the gentle lull of midday peace. It was in these rare pauses that she felt the weight of motherhood not as a burden but as a grounding force, a quiet, unwavering anchor that held her steady even when winter tried its hardest to shake her resolve. Her thoughts drifted to the seasons beyond winter, the soft green of spring fields, the golden warmth of summer hearthbread baking in the open air, the vibrant rustle of autumn leaves, and she felt a faint, hopeful ache within her chest, the kind that reminded her that winter, though fierce and relentless, was not eternal. Spring would come again as it always had, thawing the earth, warming the cottage, restoring the rhythm of work and life in ways lighter and easier than the struggle of these long, cold months. But she did not linger too long in dreams of future seasons. Winter demanded attention in the present, and she knew better than to waste energy on longing when there were tasks waiting quietly for their turn. Still, that small spark of hope, that gentle whisper of future warmth comforted her, gave her strength, and wrapped itself around her heart like a soft blanket. After a long while she stood again, placing the drowsy child gently onto the thickest blanket near the fire, tucking the edges around him so he remained cocooned in warmth, even as she moved away. He murmured softly, adjusting his small body into the familiar comfort of the bedding, and she brushed a lock of hair from his forehead before returning to her tasks. She walked toward the storage shelves, checking the jars and bundles lined neatly along the wooden planks, dried berries, cured roots, bunches of herbs tied with twine, a few precious strips of smoked meat. She inspected each item with practiced care, making mental notes of what needed to be rationed more carefully and what could be used freely for the midday meal. Then, with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood the value of every minute of daylight, she began gathering ingredients for a simple stew that would simmer slowly over the fire, filling the cottage with warmth and nourishment as the day wove its way toward evening. She chopped the roots into thin, even slices, their earthy scent rising softly into the air, and added handfuls of dried leaves that crumbled easily between her fingers, releasing their fragrance into the pot where the water was already beginning to warm. The children watched as she prepared the meal, their eyes following the movements of her hands as though they were witnessing a sacred ritual, and in many ways they were. Winter cooking was an act of preservation, of hope, of transformation, turning the meager remnants of autumn into sustenance that carried them through the coldest months. Once everything had been added to the pot, she placed a sturdy lid over it and adjusted its position near the hottest part of the fire, allowing the flames to lick gently at the bottom as the stew began to bubble slowly. The rich scent filled the room little by little, weaving warmth into the air and easing the cold's quiet pressure at the edges of the cottage. Her children drifted back into play, their soft laughter mingling with the steady crackle of the hearth, and the mother stood watching them, feeling again that deep, quiet swell of love that held her upright through every challenge the winter placed before her. She stepped back toward the door, opening it just a sliver to read the weather once more, and found the sky unchanged, pale, muted, heavy with the weight of unseen sunlight. The cold greeted her instantly, brushing her cheeks with its sharp edge, and she closed the door again, sealing herself back into the sanctuary of firelight and warmth that she had built with her own hands. And as she stood there, leaning lightly against the wooden frame, She felt the fullness of the moment settle into her, the fire burning steadily, the stew simmering softly, the children safe and warm, the tasks of the day unfolding at a gentle pace. And she understood again that survival in winter was not defined by grand victories, but by the quiet constancy of days like this, where every breath, every movement, every small act of care kept the cold at bay. It was in these long, tender hours of calm that she found the strength to face the nights ahead, to rekindle the fire again and again, to wrap her children in warmth against the unforgiving dark, to greet each dawn knowing she had won another battle in the endless war against winter. As the early afternoon settled gently over the cottage, the medieval mother felt the day reaching its quiet midpoint. That stretch of time when the outside world lay frozen in stillness, when the paths between the homes were deserted, and when the cold, although sharp and unyielding, felt less predatory than it did during the long hours of night or the pale, fragile moments of dawn. It was a time of calm diligence, a time for slow tasks, a time when the cottage felt more like a living heart beating softly against the vast silence of winter. She checked the simmering stew again, lifting the wooden lid and letting a wave of fragrant steam rise into the air, carrying with it the earthy scent of roots, herbs, and the small handful of dried vegetables she had carefully rationed for this meal. The warmth of the steam brushed gently across her face, softening the cold that still lingered faintly at the edges of the room, and she stirred the pot with calm, measured movements, watching the ingredients swirl slowly together, as though weaving the essence of comfort itself. Her children had drifted into a quieter form of play, no longer bold and curious as in the morning, but softer, more contemplative, their movements slower as the weight of the warm room lulled them into a peaceful drowsiness. The middle child nestled on a blanket near the fire, tracing gentle patterns into the straw with one small finger, while the eldest rearranged wooden animals into a circle, creating a scene he seemed to narrate under his breath with hushed, almost melodic tones. The youngest, exhausted from the small adventures of the day, had slipped into a peaceful nap, his tiny body curled into a perfect crescent beneath a neatly folded woolen blanket. His breath rose and fell in gentle waves, so soft it was barely visible in the firelight, and the mother paused for a moment just to watch the quiet serenity on his face, a moment of stillness that filled her heart with a warmth far deeper than anything the hearth could produce. Outside, the winter wind swept lightly across the rooftops, carrying with it the faint hiss of snow shifting under its touch. The sky had brightened slightly, though not with the bold light of sun, but with the pale glow of daylight diffused through a thick veil of clouds. It cast the world in a soft, muted tone, turning every shape, the fences, the trees, the distant cottages, into silhouettes wrapped in silver-grey softness. She approached the window and lifted the shutter just enough to allow a sliver of this cold light into the room. It spilled across the floor in a narrow band, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air like tiny, wandering stars. The cold pressed instantly against her exposed skin, and she closed the shutter again, tucking the warmth securely inside the home. She then moved to gather her sewing kit, a simple wooden box filled with needles, thread, snippets of cloth, and bits of leather, and sat beside the fire, selecting her eldest child's cloak from the pile of garments in need of attention. The seam near the shoulder had grown thin, and she held the fabric in her hands, running her fingers over the worn edge with a tenderness that revealed how deeply she understood the meaning of wear in winter. A frayed seam was not just an inconvenience. It was a potential opening for the cold to slither through, to tug at the body beneath, to drain warmth in small, unrelenting increments. With steady hands she threaded the needle and began to stitch, her movements slow and deliberate, each pull of the thread tightening the cloak's strength, reinforcing it stitch by stitch. Her children watched her with soft eyes, captivated by the hypnotic rhythm of the needle slipping through fabric, the subtle dance of her fingers as she worked. In winter, sewing was as essential as fire, a craft of love and endurance that protected skin and bone as much as any roaring flame. As she worked, she listened to the sounds around her. The low, contented breathing of her sleeping child, the faint crackle of the fire as it shifted, the occasional whisper exchanged between her older children, their words too soft to catch but full of comfort nonetheless. Even the subtle hum of the simmering stew seemed to harmonize with the rhythm of the cottage, creating a soundscape that felt as soothing and intimate as a lullaby. After a long while, she finished the seam, running her fingers along it to ensure its strength before folding the cloak neatly and setting it aside. Her hands, though tired from the precise work, held the quiet satisfaction of a task completed with devotion, a satisfaction that warmed her chest as she prepared to move on to the next garment in need of attention. But before she could, the eldest child approached her with a shy, uncertain expression, holding in his hands a small, uneven braid he had fashioned from the leather strips in the weaving basket. He offered it to her with both hands, his voice a whisper barely louder than the crackle of the fire, as he explained, haltingly, that he had made it for her, not because she needed it, but because he wanted to give her something warm in return. The mother's heart softened instantly, her breath catching in a faint tremor of emotion. She took the small braid gently, her fingers brushing the rough leather, and held it to her chest with a gratitude so deep it needed no words. In the quiet world of winter, such gestures held immense power. They wrapped themselves around the heart like a second cloak, warming in ways no fire could. She pulled him close, her hands cupping the sides of his face as she pressed a kiss to his forehead, her voice low and tender as she thanked him. His cheeks flushed with pride, his eyes shimmering with the glow of the fire, and he returned to his play with a lightness in his step that made her smile. She tied the braid around her wrist, letting it rest there as a small reminder of resilience, not only hers but his, and that of all her children who endured the cold with her, who offered their own small acts of strength and kindness without understanding how powerful they truly were. The stew continued to simmer, filling the air with a warm, comforting aroma. The fire continued to burn steadily, casting soft waves of gold across the room. The children's presence continued to fill the cottage with gentle, living warmth. And the mother, sitting beside the hearth with the leather braid on her wrist and her sewing in her lap, felt the fullness of the moment settle deeply into her chest. It was a moment of quiet balance, of warmth sustained, of needs met, of love expressed in the simplest, truest ways, and she understood again why she fought so fiercely against the cold, why she rose before dawn and labored long after dusk. Because within these fragile hours of peace, when her children were safe and warm and nourished, she found not only relief but purpose, a purpose woven into every stitch, every flame, every breath shared inside these walls. And in that warm, glowing room, surrounded by firelight, quiet tasks, and the soft heartbeat of her children's Sip's presence, she felt again that unbreakable truth. Winter might rule the world outside, but inside this cottage, love ruled the light. As the pale afternoon light slowly began its descent toward evening, softening the already muted glow that filtered through the wooden shutters, the medieval mother felt the deep rhythm of the day shifting once more, guiding her gently toward the slow preparations for nightfall. The fire had burned faithfully throughout the long hours, its orange pulse steady and warm, and the cottage held within its walls a fragile tenderness, the kind that existed only when every small effort had come together to create a sanctuary against the world outside. She rose from her place near the hearth, feeling the warmth lingering in her bones, and walked softly across the room, gathering blankets, smoothing the straw beneath them, arranging each layer with the slow, deliberate care of someone who understood that comfort in winter was not a simple luxury, but a delicate architecture built through touch, attentiveness, and love. Her children watched her movements with the quiet familiarity of those who had lived these cycles many times, their bodies instinctively preparing for the slower, softer rhythm of evening. As the stew reached its final simmering warmth, she ladled it into wooden bowls, handing each child a portion with calm, steady hands. They ate with small, appreciative breaths, leaning close to the hearth where the fire's glow painted their faces with soft stripes of gold. It was not a feast, no winter meal ever was, but it carried a warmth that spread through their limbs, loosening the day's tension, replacing hunger with gentle fullness. After the meal, she rinsed the bowls with warm water, her hands moving slowly, thoughtfully, as she listened to the faint sounds of the village outside, a distant door closing, a muffled conversation drifting like a half-forgotten dream through the cold air, the soft crunch of footsteps, as someone made their final preparations for the night. The world beyond her cottage felt far away, wrapped in its own stories, its own rituals of endurance, its own small triumphs and losses that winter pressed quietly into the land. Inside, however, the rhythm was softer, the children curled together on the warm bedding she had arranged, their voices fading into whispers as sleep crept toward them with gentle insistence. The youngest nestled against her side, his head rising and falling with the slow cadence of her breath, while the older two settled into the familiar comfort of shared warmth, their eyelids heavy, their bodies relaxing into the safety of one another's presence. She pulled the blankets over them, tucking the edges carefully to seal out the cold, and warmed fresh stones by the hearth before sliding them beneath the layers at the foot of the bedding. The heat radiated upward in a soothing wave, and she could almost feel the tension leave their small bodies, replaced by that precious, fragile sense of security that only a warm bed in winter could give. Finally, when everything was prepared, the door secured, the fire banked in a way that would allow it to smoulder gently through the night, the blankets tucked, the shadows softened by the glow of the coals, she settled beside her children, her body forming a protective shape around theirs. The fire cast faint ripples of orange across the wooden beams overhead, and for a long moment she simply lay there, listening to the soft rhythmic breaths intertwining with the faint sighs of the hearth. Winter pressed against the walls outside, unrelenting as ever, its cold settling thickly over the village, but inside the cottage warmth lingered like a guardian, holding the darkness at bay. She felt the day's weariness wrapping around her in slow velvet waves, but it was not the harsh weariness of struggle. It was the gentle weariness of purpose fulfilled, of love expressed in countless small tasks, of knowing that her children were safe and warm because she had made it so, hour by hour, breath by breath. In that quiet, tender moment, as the last traces of light faded from the sky and night descended with its usual winter heaviness, she allowed her eyes to drift closed. The fire's glow softened into a warm hush, the children's breathing settled into deep, even rhythms, and the cottage, humble, worn but resolutely alive, embraced them all in a fragile cocoon of warmth, carved skillfully out of the unforgiving cold. And she understood, as sleep finally pulled her into its calm depths, that this was the secret mothers had carried through every winter since time immemorial. That warmth was not merely fire or wool, but presence, vigilance, tenderness woven through every moment of the day. That survival was not a single act, but a tapestry of countless small gestures. And that love, quiet and tireless, was the one force strong enough to keep the cold from claiming what she held most dear. In the heart of winter, wrapped in her children, sit steady breathing, and the soft pulse of the hearth, she rested, knowing that tonight, as on every night, she had kept them warm.